100 white heads lifted as one, a silent question posed to the bruised twilight sky. From her porch, Adelaide Finch watched the movement ripple through the flock, a living current on the still, brown water that had swallowed her world. Behind her, arrayed in a silent, dark line, stood the people of Prairie Ridge. They were not mocking now. Their faces, illuminated by the few lanterns they carried, were etched with a kind of reverent disbelief. Her dog, Kaiser, sat at her feet, his body a warm, solid anchor in the shifting reality of the evening. She had finally understood what the water gives. It was never just about what it takes away. This strange, floating harvest, this congregation of man and beast at the edge of her drowned fields, was the culmination of a gamble that had cost her everything she had left, starting with her own good sense. It had begun 6 months earlier, under a sun that knew only how to bake and burn. Life then was a series of hard, dry tasks. Mending fences that enclosed nothing but dust. Hauling water from a well that seemed to drop an inch a day. The small farmhouse was a shell of quiet, filled with the ghost of her husband, Ben, in the worn spot on the floorboards by the stove, in the scent of sawdust that still clung to his tools in the barn. She was 25, but the townsfolk spoke of her as the poor widow Finch, a creature of pity, a problem to be solved with sympathetic glances and quiet offers of charity she always refused. Her days were measured by the sun's arc and Kaiser's steady companionship. They moved together through the parched landscape, a solitary woman and her loyal shepherd, a small island of stubborn existence in an ocean of indifference. The land was all she had of Ben, and she worked it with a ferocity born of grief, trying to wring life from a place that seemed determined to give none. The earth was cracked and silent, and the sky was a vast, empty promise. The promise was broken not by relief, but by ruin. The rain began as a whisper, a soft patter on the tin roof that was, for a day, a blessing. Then the whisper became a roar. For 7 days and 7 nights, the sky opened and wept without cease. The dry creek bed behind the property, a dusty scar for as long as she could remember, became a churning brown serpent. It swelled and slithered over its banks, and then it kept coming. Adelaide stood at her window, Kaiser whining softly beside her, and watched the water devour her world. It crept up the neat rows of her failed garden, swamped the chicken coop, and turned her lower pasture into a vast, murky lake. When the deluge finally subsided, the sun rose on a changed landscape. Her farm was gone, submerged beneath a placid, muddy expanse that stretched to the horizon, mirroring the pale, empty sky. The tops of her fence posts were tiny specks in the distance. The barn stood on a small island of its own, its foundation half drowned. Neighbors came by in wagons, their horses splashing through the new shallows on the road. They offered sorrowful words, their eyes scanning the devastation. Jedediah Blevins, the cattle baron whose vast ranch bordered her small plot, rode up on a fine black horse, the water barely touching its fetlocks. "A terrible shame, little widow," he said, his voice thick with a sympathy she did not trust. "Nothing's but ruin. You'll be lucky to get pennies on the dollar for this swamp." They all saw the same thing, an end. They saw a drowned farm and a defeated woman. But as Adelaide stood alone on her porch, the smell of wet earth and decay thick in the air, the water lapping just a few feet below the steps, she felt the first flicker of something other than despair. The water was a curse, a taker, a thief. But it was also, she was beginning to suspect, something else entirely. In the depths of her exhaustion, a memory surfaced, a story Ben had told her on a cold winter's night. He'd spoken of his grandfather, an immigrant from a land of fens and marshes, who had settled in a river valley back east that was prone to biblical floods. One year, a flood just like this one had wiped out every farm for 50 miles. While others despaired, the old man had looked at the miles of stagnant, shallow water and seen not a disaster, but a pantry. The water, he'd said, was teeming with life you couldn't see, snails, larvae, waterweeds, a million tiny creatures that thrived in the muck. It was a feast waiting for the right kind of diner. While his neighbors were selling their land for nothing, Ben's grandfather had spent his last dollars on 100 ducks. The creatures had taken to the water as if born from it, feasting and fattening on the flood's hidden bounty. By the time the waters receded, he had the plumpest birds in the state and a reputation as either a genius or a madman. "Water's an honest banker," Ben had quoted the old man. It always pays back what it borrows, one way or another. The words echoed in the quiet farmhouse, taking on a new and urgent meaning. Adelaide walked to the edge of the water, Kaiser sniffing cautiously at the muddy bank. She looked out over the immense, silent lake that had been her farm. She thought of the life stirring beneath the surface. She thought of the town's pity. She thought of Jedediah Blevins's predatory gaze. And something in her settled. The water wasn't an ending. It was a field, just of a different sort. It was a pasture that required a different kind of herd. Her course was set, a fool's errand to anyone else, but to her, it was the only path that wasn't a surrender. Her first and only stop for counsel was at Martha Hawley's homestead, a mile down the only passable road. Martha, a widow herself for 20 years, was a woman carved from pragmatism and hard-won sense. She greeted Adelaide at the door, her face a mask of concern, and led her into a kitchen that smelled of yeast and wood smoke. Adelaide, clutching a cup of chicory coffee, laid out her plan. She spoke of Ben's grandfather, of the life in the water, of her intention to buy ducks. 300 of them. Martha listened, her expression slowly shifting from sympathy to disbelief, and finally to alarm. When Adelaide finished, the older woman set her own cup down with a sharp click. "Adelaide Finch, have you lost your mind?" she asked, her voice not unkind, but sharp with worry. "That flood took everything from you. You can't throw what little you have left into that mud pit." "Ducks? Child, that's a fantasy. A folktale." She leaned forward, her work-worn hands gripping the edge of the table. "The sensible thing, the only thing, is to sell the deed to Blevins before the bank takes it anyway. He'll give you something. You come into town. You can work at the boarding house. It's a hard life, but it's a life. This is a dream that will leave you with nothing but wet feathers." Every word was a brick in a wall of logic, of conventional wisdom. Martha was trying to save her, to guide her onto the safe, trodden path. "A smart woman works with the current," Martha finished softly, not against it. Adelaide looked at her friend, seeing the genuine fear in her eyes. "Maybe this is working with the current," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. Just a different one. She left Martha's house with a heavy heart, the weight of her friend's disapproval pressing down on her. But it did not change her direction. She was charting a new course, and she would sail it alone. The journey to the larger settlement of Silver Creek took a full day. She found Finian Cole at his mercantile, a long, low building that smelled of grain, leather, and iron. He was a spare man, with eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. He listened to her request for 300 Aylesbury ducklings without a flicker of surprise. He simply made a note in a ledger. "That'll be a special order," he said. "Take a week. Require payment up front." He named a price that made her stomach clench. It was nearly all the money Ben had left her, the emergency fund tucked away in a loose floorboard. She counted it out onto the counter, the worn bills and coins representing her last tie to a secure world. Finn Cole counted it twice, then nodded. "They'll arrive by freight wagon Tuesday next," he stated. News of the transaction moved faster than the wagon ever could. By the time she returned to Prairie Ridge, her peculiar purchase was the talk of the town. The whispers followed her as she bought supplies at the general store. In the saloon, Jedediah Blevins held court, his voice booming over the low murmur of the room. "Here the widow Finch is starting her own navy," he roared, slapping his thigh. A wave of rough laughter answered him. "Thinks she'll raise a fleet on that mudhole. More fool her. That land's good for grazing once it dries, and I aim to have it." The public mockery was a fresh wound, but Adelaide bore it with a stoic calm she did not feel. She was an outcast, a figure of fun, the town eccentric. On the promised Tuesday, the freight wagon arrived, its cargo a cacophony of frantic peeping. 300 tiny, yellow ducklings blinked in the harsh light as she and the wagon driver unloaded the crates. She set the first ones down at the water's edge. After a moment of hesitation, they took to the flood, a flotilla of impossible, bobbing life on the brown water. She watched them, a lump in her throat, as her navy took command of its new ocean. The day settled into a new rhythm, dictated by the needs of her flock. Each morning at dawn, she would emerge from the farmhouse, Kaiser at her heels, to the sight of the ducks spread across the water, their white bodies dotting the vast expanse like scattered petals. They were voracious, tireless foragers, paddling through the shallows, their heads dipping below the surface to feast on the rich ecosystem the flood had created. She built low shelters for them on the high ground near the barn, simple lean-tos to protect them from the worst of the sun and the occasional predator. The work was endless and solitary, but it was a living work. She was not tending a dead field, she was shepherding a thriving one. Finn Cole became a quiet, constant presence in this new life. Every fortnight, he would arrive in his buckboard, loaded with sacks of supplemental grain. He never offered opinions or pity, only clipped, practical observations. "They're putting on weight," he'd remark, his eyes scanning the flock. Good sheen on the feather one afternoon, he pointed to a bare patch of earth near the barn that the water hadn't reached. "They need grit," he said. "For the gizzard. Helps them grind their food. Spread some of that corn over there. They'll find it." It was the most he had ever said at one time. His advice was always sound, and his visits became a small, reliable point in her isolated existence. He would unload the feed, accept her payment, and leave with a simple nod. But in his unsentimental competence, Adelaide found a strange kind of support. He treated her venture not as a fool's errand, but as a business transaction, and that legitimacy was worth more than any words of encouragement. The ducklings grew, their yellow down replaced by sleek white feathers. The cacophony of peeps deepened into a chorus of contented quacks. They were thriving, and with them, so was a fragile shoot of hope within her. The success of the flock did not go unnoticed. Travelers on the main road would stop their wagons to stare at the bizarre and beautiful sight of a shimmering white flock covering the brown lake. Word filtered back to town that the widow Finch's folly was not failing. Jedediah Blevins heard the talk, and it soured his mood. He had been waiting patiently for her to give up, for the ducks to die off, for her to come to him, defeated, ready to sign over her deed. Her quiet success was an affront, a disruption to the natural order of things as he saw it. He started his campaign subtly. He spoke casually in the saloon of fowl sickness, how birds raised on stagnant water often carried diseases that could poison a town's water supply. He mentioned to the county clerk that such an unusual operation probably violated some forgotten ordinance. The seeds of doubt were planted, but they didn't sprout fast enough for his liking. The ducks were visibly healthy, and Adelaide, though an outcast, was known to be clean and meticulous. So Blevins chose a more direct weapon. He held the note on her land, a loan Ben had taken out for seed and equipment the year before he died. The terms were clear, small payments for 3 years, with a large balloon payment at the end. But a small clause, one he had his lawyer point out, allowed the lender to call the note due if the property was deemed to be used for a non-standard or high-risk agricultural enterprise. One crisp autumn afternoon, Blevins's foreman rode out to the farm. He handed Adelaide an official-looking letter. It informed her that, due to the unorthodox and precarious nature of her aquatic fowl experiment, the bank, of which Blevins was the primary director, was calling the loan. She had 60 days to produce the full remaining balance. 60 days, or the foreclosure process would begin. The letter felt like a stone in her hand. 60 days. It was an impossible deadline. The ducks were plump and nearly ready for market, but preparing and transporting 300 birds to the city market in Denver was a monumental task, one that would take weeks she didn't have. And even if she could, the profits might not be enough. The number on the page was staggering, a mountain of debt she could not see the top of. The hope that had sustained her for months crumbled into dust. The flock, once a symbol of her ingenuity, now seemed a monument to her foolishness. Martha had been right. Blevins had been right. She had flown in the face of sense, and this was the consequence. That evening, she walked to the water's edge, the place where her mad dream had been born. Kaiser pressed against her leg, sensing her despair. The sun was setting, casting long, mournful shadows across the water. The ducks floated serenely, their white bodies catching the last golden rays of light, oblivious to the invisible cage that was closing around their owner. She felt the full, crushing weight of her solitude. Ben was gone. Her only friend in town thought her a fool. Her neighbors saw her as a joke. She had defied them all, determined to prove her strength, her self-reliance. She had wanted to build this victory alone, a testament to her own resilience. But now, alone was all she was. The quiet lapping of the water sounded like a final, gentle mockery. She had gambled everything on the water, and the water had delivered. But she had forgotten about the land, and the men who wrote the rules on it. She had failed. The farm would be lost, not to the flood, but to the cold, hard math of a rich man's ledger. As darkness fell completely, a profound stillness settled over the drowned fields. In that deep quiet, sitting by the water with her dog's warm head resting on her knee, a thought broke through her despair. It was not the water that had failed her, or the ducks. It was her own stubborn pride. She had remembered Ben's grandfather's method, but she had forgotten the most important part of the story. He hadn't done it alone. The tale, as Ben told it, was that the whole valley, seeing his success, had pitched in for the harvest, men to pluck, women to dress the birds, neighbors offering their wagons for the long trip to market. The prophet had saved not just one farm, but many. The lesson wasn't about the cleverness of one man, it was about the resilience of a community. She had been so focused on proving she didn't need anyone that she had failed to see that no one ever truly succeeds alone. The next day was the town's annual Founders' Day picnic, a rare occasion when the entire population of Prairie Ridge gathered. Adelaide had never planned to go. But now, with a new, terrifying resolve, she washed her face, put on her best dress, and walked the long road to the town square. She arrived late. The whole town was there, eating and talking under the shade of the cottonwoods. She saw Jedediah Blevins holding court near the barbecue pit. She saw Martha Hawley organizing the children's sack races. She took a deep breath and walked to the small wooden platform used for speeches. She stepped up onto it, her heart hammering against her ribs. A hush fell over the crowd as they turned to look at the town fool. Her voice, when it came, was shaky but clear. She told them everything. She told them about the loan, the 60-day deadline, and Blevins's maneuver. She didn't ask for money. "I can't do it alone," she said, her eyes sweeping over their faces. "The birds are ready. But I need help to process them, to get them to market. I can't pay you in cash. But I can offer a share, an honest share, of whatever they bring." A heavy silence followed her plea. The townsfolk looked at each other, at the ground, at Blevins, who was smiling a tight, confident smile. He had won. The silence stretched, becoming unbearable. Then, a single figure moved. It was Martha Hawley. She walked to the foot of the platform and turned to face the crowd, her expression grim. "I was the first to tell this girl she was a fool," Martha said, her voice carrying across the square. "I told her to give up. I have never been more wrong in my life. I've watched her work harder than any two men in this valley. That water didn't beat her, and I'll not stand by and let a piece of paper do it either. I'll help." Her declaration broke the spell. A blacksmith, a man who had laughed at Blevins's jokes, stepped forward. "I have 2 strong sons. We can build the crates." The freight operator, who had delivered the ducklings, spoke up next. "My wagon's going to Denver next week anyway. It can carry her birds." Then old man Hemlock, who rarely spoke at all, hobbled forward, leaning on his cane. "My grandpappy farmed ducks on the Great Flood of '48, he rasped, his voice thin but clear. Said a duck on a flood was better'n gold in the bank. He always said it took the whole town to catch 'em one by one." They came forward, women offering to help pluck and dress, men offering their labor, their tools, their time. It was a cascade of support, a quiet revolution against the town's established order. Jedediah Blevins stood frozen at the back of the crowd, his smile gone. He watched his power, his influence, dissolve into thin air. He was not shouted down or confronted. He was simply rendered irrelevant. Without a word, he turned and walked away from the picnic, a solitary figure retreating from the community he thought he controlled. In his place stood Adelaide, on the platform, tears streaming down her face as she looked out at the sea of neighbors who had finally, truly, seen her.